Hi guys, I am Rory from G2G Coaching, and today we are going to talk about how to gauge training intensity and how to progress training when you are training at home. This is coming off the back of some of the other videos we've put out that have gone over putting in foundations with movements to allow you to put yourself in a position to be more successful when you come out of lockdown and go back and return to gym training. And why not start now versus waiting for that to happen? And then also Aidan went over, one of the other coaches here, went over load placement and how varying load placement can be a really useful tool in giving you more exercise variations to use at home. So there's a lot of different exercise variations that can be used to adapt the training stimulus that you're trying to get. But there's one missing piece to this. So we've talked about kind of movement technique, which is more what Ollie covered, and how the foundational movements and practicing them can be really useful. We then also talked about with Aidan how you can adapt load placement to make things different in your training. But there's one thing that really is important, how to gauge training intensity, because intensity and effort levels are going to really drive a lot of training adaptations. And that's something we can definitely control and still do at home, but it might look a little bit different. So previously, when you've been maybe training in the gym, your gauge of training intensity has been probably more load on the bar versus what it is at the moment, which might be just body weight, or it might just be a light load or a single load like a kettlebell or a set of dumbbells, and that's all you've got to use. But that's still really useful and still a viable option to make training progress. The big difference is it might not be as efficient as using barbells and weights in the gym, but it's still moving you towards where you want to go. You're still getting a training stimulus out of it. The way that we do that at G2G Coaching is we use basically a measure of your proximity to failure or a measure of your perceived effort. So that's called, more commonly known as RPE, which is rating of perceived exertion, or RIR, which means reps in reserve. So those two are usually used interchangeably. And what that basically means is how, if I did a set, I want to gauge how many reps I have left in the tank. And by gauging that can give me a good understanding that I'm getting to the appropriate training intensity to get the adaptation I desire. When we're at home, you can still make really good progress with light loads. There's a lot of research that uses light load strength training, and they still see a hypertrophy response from said training. And it doesn't have to be extremely, the common misconceptions, if you're not lifting heavy, you're not getting a training response. Like I said, it's not going to be maybe as efficient as it could be, but you can still get a response if you manage the effort level. So if we can gauge where we're at based on our effort level, so we say we want to get close to the point where we're almost at failure, but not there, because that would lead to technique breakdown, and that's always important, as Ollie mentioned in his video. That's going to be really important, and what we preach here in G2G Coaching is technique above all else. But then if we want to make sure that we're training at a level of intensity that is going to stimulate stuff, we then need to gauge that on a scale of reps left in the tank. So when we've got light load training, we want to use sets where we do reps until we get very, very close to failure. Not at failure, but close to it, to get the training response we want. But how do you know where that failure level is? How do you know where the rep number is for a certain exercise and a certain kettlebell that you've got at home? A really easy and simple way you can do that is using anchor sets or AMRAP sets. So what you do with that is you do say it's a kettlebell deadlift you basically do reps until you get very, very close to failure, what we call technical failure. So when technique starts to really change, you start to maybe round your back more, or you feel like it's not you don't feel it in the right areas where you think you should. And then you basically record that, and that gives you a gauge, a marker for how many reps you can do in a single effort. And then your training that you do outstanding of that is going to be sets where you go close to that point, but not quite at the same level. So it's hard, but it's not all out hard. And that way you can then still continue to give yourself the appropriate training intensity to continue to make progress whilst at home. However, if we want to make progress, as I said just there, we really have to make sure we're tracking that training. So it's really important to measure the amount of reps that you do at home with the light loads that you might have. Okay, if you do have the ability to add some load, that is one way of progressing training. But if you don't, and you've just got body weight and a single weight, then reps is the way to see progression over time. And as I mentioned at the start of the video, it's a different perspective. Most of the time it's weight on the bar that's used as the progression measure. But because of the lockdown and what we've got going on at the moment, you can use reps instead, and it's still gonna show improvements as a proxy measure of hypertrophy if you're trying to gain some muscle mass, or if you're trying to just move better with the same amount of load. That's a great measure for tracking reps over time, because you're able to maintain your technique for further into the set. You're able to get more reps and maintain the positions that you're looking for. So that's another indirect measure of strength. And then you also want to make sure that you're keeping a diary of that, because if you measure your AMRAP set once and then don't come back to it for ages, it's not going to be useful. So we want to try and make sure, if you're at home and you've never done this before, definitely track your reps over time on the same exercises, okay? And another aspect to this is going back to the anchor sets, going back to these AMRAP sets after some period of time of training where you haven't gone to that point for a while, and repeating the same exercise. We use that a lot at GTG coaching. We've seen real big improvements in people's ability to improve the number of reps they've got on these AMRAP sets, and that is a way of getting some payback from the work you're doing, where you're not going quite as close to failure, but you're still getting close to it. So, to gauge training intensity, we use the RPE, or a way to think about that simply to start with is a measure of your own perceived effort. How hard is it? And when we're at home and we're using light loads, we want to try and get close to that point of failure, because it's not as efficient training stimulus as weights we have in the gym. Now, to gauge where that point is, we want to use anchor sets or AMRAP sets, because that gives us a line in the sand of where we know we can go to if we have to, but we're not going to go quite to that point. So we're going to go close to that line, but not at it. So we use that as a measuring point to start with. Then we do our training close to or at it. And then from there, we then track what we're doing by tracking our reps mostly, if our light load training is staying the same. Using a diary over time, we can see if that is progressing. It might be the case that as you progress and get better with training, you with a certain exercise you get stronger, you then can see that your reps are creeping very close to the first time you did this AMRAP set, but you're not breaking down in technical failure anymore. And that's a really easy way to see, right, I'm making progress, I'm moving towards where I want to go. Another useful tip to get as a marker that you're understanding how to use this idea of proximity to failure, of going close to failure but not quite, is if you're doing sets on a given exercise and your rep numbers gradually drop from set 1 to set 2 to set 3, set 4. Generally speaking, if everything else is kept equal, that is a way that you can, is a good marker that you are implementing, using effort as a measure of your intensity in your training. Because if you're hitting the same effort every single time, you should be carrying some fatigue from the one set into the next set into the next set. And that's one way to gauge that you're really starting to understand how to use RPE or reps in reserve based training. So guys, I hope that helped you understand how you might not just use training load, which is what you might use in the gym, use more training reps and use more of an effort index of an RPE or RIR, reps in reserve based index, to track your training over time and make sure you're training with enough intensity to get a training stimulus.